First, let's take a look at the finished Dream. Abalone is a two-player abstract board game similar to chess or Go. It starts with a short intro cinematic that manipulates lights and camera and disables all controller input except X. X brings you to the title screen where you select a control scheme and set up positions for the 28 marbles on the board. You toggle between pass and play and 2 controller mode and then hit any of the face buttons to set up the table. Let's pick the Fujiyama position with square for now. The game then emits all 28 marbles in your chosen position and unlocks the cursor. This can be moved on 2 axes but can only be rotated in steps of 60 degrees, so it will only ever face one of 6 directions. It will turn green when indicating a legal move and red when indicating the illegal move. D-pad left will open up the controls and D-pad right will open the rules. In Abalone, your goal is to push 6 of the opponent's marbles off the table. You can always move up to 3 of your own marbles in any direction, or you can push up to 2 of the opponent's marbles off the table, or in any direction on the table, provided that you do so with a higher number of your own marbles. But no more than 3 at a time. Players take turns, and the turn switch is done with the touchpad button. If you enable 2 controller mode, this button disables all controls for the other player's controller. Player switch is indicated with a change of light from the white player to the black player and back. When a marble is pushed down, it shatters on impact and increases that player's score as indicated by the marble holdings at the bottom and top. Once a player has lost 6 marbles, the short victory animation plays. The victory cam turns on and X resets the dream to the beginning. This is what it looks like in the editor. We have a bunch of sculpts for the table and the setup positions with an associated light. And here's a tray that can emit the marbles and the splinters when we need them, as well as a bunch of invisible walls. There's 5 major chips that govern the rules of this game. There's the scores and the victory chip, the rules and control display, the setup positions and title menu chip, as well as 1 chip in the selector itself here, the selector logic that governs most of what the controller does, and a white and a black chip within each marble that governs how these marbles can move. The intro is here, just a small chip with some weather and effects and timeline. And once that timeline is finished, it triggers this chip, which handles the menu and the title screen. Most of this chip is deleted after you've selected a position for the marbles. So when the menu is finished playing, it turns this signal on, which is just a timeline of a X button pulsing. And if you press the X button here while this is playing, it turns on another switch, and that switch turns on the setup positions. So you press X and then these become visible, as well as the lights. It then kills most of this. It destroys the initial switch and it feeds a signal here to the main part of this chip, which is this position selector. This is just a dialog text displayer with all text empty, so it just displays 4 button prompts. While this is displaying here, we destroy the title card. And here there is a counter currently set to 0. It's waiting to be set to 1. And once this is 1, all of this goes away and the actual game starts. So it listens to whether or not the player makes any selection here, and when it does, the game begins. We turn the cursor on with the keyframe, which is currently set to off, and destroy a bunch of stuff. Also listening to any of those prompts is the pick control scheme. This is an extra chip because it was a very late addition. It governs which control scheme you pick, whether you want to play with one controller or two. So it listens to the up and down signal or the left stick and feeds it to a selector to choose between either control scheme 1 or control scheme 2. These are variable modifiers that just set a variable that's called control scheme to either 1 or 0, while also turning these cursors and the text displays on and off or highlighting them. We can feed the directional input directly into the selector, left, up and down. But for the stick we have to split it into the Y signal, which is up and down, and then see if it's below 0 or above 0, which corresponds to up and down, and then turn this analog signal into a digital signal by just turning a pulse when it happens, and that triggers the selector. And once again, if you make any selection here for the positions, for these setup positions, it will destroy this logic and just save whatever the variable was when we selected it. The position selector has a lot of wires going out of it because every one of those choices corresponds to one set of emitters turning on. This is the array of emitters for the marbles. The large ones are all possible positions for black marbles, and the small ones are all possible positions for the white marbles. Since we can change the color of those chips, changing the size is one way to distinguish between them. Once a selection has been made, it'll check whether it takes a white marble or a black one and where to put them. Then the selector is destroyed, the cursor is turned on, and another chip takes over. The setup, as I said, the setup positions and title chip has a counter, and when that counter turns 1, that pretty much means the game is beginning. And if that does, it turns on these two chips, which is the rules and controls display and the player switch weather. This just listens to the cursor, and whenever we switch players, it plays either the black to white timeline or the white to black timeline, which just changes the light and plays a sound. That's all that this does. The rules and control display is always on, and it governs the display of the rules here and the controls. Listens to left and right inputs and then turns these on. This open tray for the controls and this indicator that you open the tray with the left button, they're connected by a NOT gate, so one of them will always be on. If this is on, then this will not be. If this is on, then this will not be. Same thing here on the other side, and then there's a sound here. You can input icons into the text displayers by using a list of commands that is found on the indreams.me page, where you start with this and then you can say something like UI arrow east, and then you close it and it turns into an arrow. And there's hundreds of symbols you can use. Now, most of the logic of the game is actually not here. It is hidden within the selector itself, within the cursor that you control. Here it is, and it has a chip on it. It's called the selector logic. And whenever you resize this chip, even a little bit, it completely bugs out the entire game, and I don't know why. And if you open this, the chip holds a lot of cables and a lot of stuff, but for now let's only look at how the control system or the cursor is moved around. And that's what this chip governs, the control selector chip. It has 3 controller sensors here, and the reason for that is a bug in the early access or a bug in my code, where if you want to manipulate the player input here, so if you want to enable control only for player 1 or only for player 2, if you use cables going to these inputs, it doesn't work, or it never worked for me. so I have to put down 3 controller sensors. They all do the same thing. It's just one of them turns on if you play with 1 controller, this one turns on if you play with 2 controllers and it's currently player 1, and this one if it's currently player 2. We have this arrangement in several places in the code, and the control summary chip governs which one should currently turn on. So whether it's scheme 0, so 1 controller, 2 controllers black, 2 controllers white. It uses the same variable, so control scheme variable, and that's either 1 or 0. If it's 0, this is just scheme 0. If it's 1, it also checks what the current player is and then outputs that. And this is the variable CP means current player, and that's either 1 or 0. So once it knows what the current player is, it has a bunch of control options. One, of course, is the mover. So the L stick is splitted into just the X value. It's split into X and Y values and feeds that into the mover, which moves at a certain speed. The L1 and R1 buttons, and also the stick, if you want to use stick turning, is fed into these timers, and they pulse for 0.1 seconds. And for these 0.1 seconds, it rotates the selector with 900 degrees per second. And somehow this translates to rotating 60 degrees to the left. I'm not sure if that math works out. It was a lot of trial and error to get this right. But this is a reliable turning at a certain degree value when you push one button. This actually took one of the longest times to figure out in the entire code, how to reliably get this to degree exactly 60 degrees to the right. And there's also a selector here, and this is triggered with the touchpad, regardless of player. And that switches players from player 0 or black to player 1 or white. This is just a conversion if you want to use the stick turning. Again, just like in the other chip, split this to the X. If it's larger than 0, if it's smaller than 0, trigger left or right. Now this part here tells the entirety of the game what rotation is currently happening, whether it's facing northeast or east or southeast and so on. I need this because the marbles need to know what direction the cursor is currently facing. So if we pin this to the screen here and go to test mode, take control of that stick, you see if I turn the stick, the logic knows the direction it is currently facing and outputs that direction as a wireless transmitter. So currently a wireless transmitter tells everything else in the game direction is currently A, or northwest. And that is what this chip does. Now that we know what the control selector does, let's look at the bigger picture. It has 3 outputs here in the chip. A and B just is the current active player and whether the touchpad was pressed down, and this turns on the animation for the player switch. If the current player is the black player, it turns on the black legal moves chip. If the current player is the white player, it turns on the white legal moves chip. These chips, and we'll look at them in a second, tell the game whether the current selection is a legal move in the game. In order to determine legal moves, we have to have a system to sense those marbles and in what combination they are on the board. This is what the sense marbles chip does, and this was the first chip I made to see if this works. The sense marbles chip looks like this. If you look at the current selector, if you look at the selector, it has 1, 2, 3, it's hard to see, 4, 5, 6 spheres, and each sphere has trigger zones in them. And these trigger zones detect whether they're currently hovering over marbles that are marked either friend or foe, and this corresponds to the color of the marble. So none of them, all of them are either friend or foe, depending what color they are. This is sensed here. So if the first part of the selector detects a black, second, third, and so on. And the same one for white. And a bunch of NOT and AND gates to see if it's neither black nor white, which means it's an empty space. The best way to show how this works is in test mode. So let's put this here. Find the cursor. It's a bit tricky. That's the cursor. Now if we move this cursor around the board like so, the different trigger zones know what color marble is currently selected. And just output that. So the sense marbles chip just always outputs 6 pieces of information, which is the color of the marble and the order in which they appear. So in this case it would be position 0 is a black one, position 3 is a black one, 1 and 2 are white, and the rest are empty. With that information we can look at the rules. So for the black legal moves, it can then know if it's A, so black, and then a free space, that's a legal move. Black, black, free, legal move, and so on. There's 6 types of legal moves for the game. If I have 3 marbles of my color, followed by 2 marbles of the opponent color, and a free space, I am allowed to move that. This is this cable. All of these cables that come out of the legal moves chips are fed into this node, and that's the legal moves. This is the text gadget, and the only reason it's here is for me to know that this is a legal move. So these chips are the same, they just inverted. So these take the white marbles as legal, and these take the black marbles as legal. Now again, there are wireless transmitters here, and they're called disable. In a move, for example, for a white and then a free space, or black in this case and a free space, it's only that first marble that should be allowed to move. So I have to tell the game that all other marbles that are currently selected, even though the selection is legal, should not move. And this will come into play later. Once the game knows the current selection is legal, it switches off the turn red. So by default, it's green. It only turns red when it is an illegal move. And then again, we have this array of 3 controller sensors depending on what player it is. And all that they listen for is the X button and the R2 button, which is my confirm button, to send the signal, go. It's a legal move as sensed by the marble sensor, and the current active player determined by the control scheme pushes the X button or the R2 button, a signal is sent over the entire playing field that's called go. And the marbles will listen for the go signal and then move accordingly. This is the logic in the selector. Within each of the sections of the selector, of the cursor, there is a tiny chip called the shortening. And all that this does is to determine whether it is part of a legal move but shouldn't move, and then just trigger the word shortening. With all that in mind, we can look at the actual logic of the marbles, which is the last missing piece. So here we have 2 marbles. They're identical except for color. And at the start of the game, 14 copies of each are emitted. Every marble has 3 chips, 2 very simple ones and the complicated ones. It has a score chip, which just as a health manager says if you die, the opponent has just scored a point. You have the splitter, which means if you hit the tray down there, kill yourself and emit 4 splinters that are also here at different directions and intensities. And this chip, the white chip and the black chip, they govern the movement. And they listen for everything that's happened so far. So they check whether they're currently selected, whether they detect the shortening, and if so, they send a not signal, so don't do anything else if you are part of the shortening. And then they detect the direction that the cursor is currently facing, so northeast, east, west, and so on. And finally, they detect whether it's go. So 4 things. If all of them are met, if they are selected, if this direction is true, if they are not part of the shortening, and if we hear go, then and only then, move. Move at a speed of 0.9 meters per second for 1.7 seconds. This is part of trial and error to figure out how these marbles can reliably move exactly the amount that they should move. So they don't actually push each other, they just all move at the same time in the same direction, but only if it's a legal move that is not shortened. If they fall off the table, they fall into the deadly tray. It's a simple chip. Just has an impact sensor that triggers a rumbler, a sound, and kills the marbles. And this just plays on loop until one person scores 6 points. A quick look at the scores in Victory, which is a big chip, but it's not actually very complicated. This is where all the variables are stored, so the current score for black and white, the control scheme and the current player. And all of this, which just checks for the current score, so is the score currently 1 for white or 2 for black, and then if that's true, turn on these sculpts here to indicate. They have no logic and no physics, they just turn on and off depending on the score. That's what all of this is. If the score, B score, equals 2, then turn this on. Actually, I don't know why these signal manipulators are here. I guess they served a purpose at some point and then don't anymore. Code redundancies. Now, however, if the scores are 6, that's when we have a win. And it's going to be either black or white. It can't be both. And if that happens, turn the cursor off. Turn all the UI elements off. These cables, they go to the other chips and then destroy whatever was left. And then play either the white Victory or the black one. And that's the last chip. In the case of a Victory for the black player, after a bunch of time, after 3.5 seconds, switch the current camera from the one that's always on top of the field here to the Victory camera, which is here. The Victory camera is connected with a motorbolt that just rotates around the field. When you win, play some Victory sounds. When you win, do some work with the camera and do some work with these text displays here. And they're supposed to mask the camera transitions. So they start big and then they turn smaller. This is what this timeline does. And we have some music that's generated. This is a chip I got from the Dreamiverse. I don't know what it does. That just makes music for me. And we have some effects. Finally, we have the return to title, which waits just a bit longer, like 10 seconds to appear. And again, it's just a pulsating X button that when you push it, goes into the global settings to, where is it? Reset scene. And that is the entire logic of this, which looks like this.